Let the noise of the day dissolve. Tonight, we are traveling back to a time of silence, snow, and shadows. Before we step into the dark, I want to know where you are joining us from tonight. Are you winding down after a long shift, or are you just starting your day? Let me know in the comments below. And if you find comfort in these deep dives into history's forgotten corners, consider subscribing. We are building a library of the unknown, and I would love for you to be a part of it. Now, take a deep breath. Let the world around you fade away. Chapter 1. The Smoke. It is a strange thing to fear a chimney. In the bitter cold of early spring, in the rural heart of Bavaria, smoke rising from a farmhouse usually signifies life. It means warmth. It means safety. It means that inside, behind the thick walls and the shuttered windows, a family is gathered around a hearth, shielded from the biting wind that sweeps across the flat, white fields. Smoke is the signal that the heart of the house is still beating. But in the first few days of April 1922, the smoke rising from the chimney of the Hinterkaifeck farmstead was not a sign of life. It was a lie. To understand the horror of what happened in those fields, you must first understand the silence. The farm known as Hinterkaifeck stood alone. It was not part of a bustling village or a tight-knit row of cottages. It was an island, drifting in a sea of snow and mud, located about a kilometre away from the nearest town of Grobern, and nestled near the forest known as the Hexenholz, the Witch's Wood. It was a fortress of solitude, built by hard hands and maintained by harder hearts. The Gruber family who lived there were known to be reclusive, wealthy, and stern. They kept to themselves, and in turn, the neighbours kept their distance. So, when the farm went quiet on the weekend of April 1st, nobody immediately panicked. Silence was the natural state of Hinterkaifeck. But there were signs, small fractures in the routine that should have raised an alarm. It began with the coffee cellar. On the afternoon of Saturday, April the 1st, a man named Hans Shirovsky arrived at the farm to take an order. The house stood imposing and still under the grey sky. He knocked on the heavy wooden door. He waited. The wind howled around the corners of the eaves, rattling the shutters, but from inside there was no answer. He walked around the yard, calling out the names of the family. Andreas, Cecilia. Nothing. The only sound was the lowing of the cattle in the barn, a sound that perhaps seemed a little too urgent, a little too distressed, but farmers are busy people. Shirovsky assumed they were out in the fields or deep in the woods. He left, stepping back into the road, leaving the silent house behind him. Then came the postman, Joseph Meyer. For years, he had walked this route, delivering the mail to the Gruber household. On Saturday, he had a letter to deliver. He approached the house, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He knocked, no answer. He peered through a window, cupping his hands against the glass to block out the glare of the snow. The kitchen was empty. The stove was cold. He left the mail on the windowsill and walked away. By Sunday, the stillness had deepened. Sunday was a holy day in Catholic Bavaria. The Grubers were devout, or at least they were present. They occupied the front pew of the church in Weidhofen every single week. Their absence was not just unusual, it was glaring. The pew stood empty. The priest intoned the Mass, the villagers murmured their prayers, but the heavy brooding presence of Andreas Gruber was missing. After the service, people whispered. It was odd, they said, but perhaps they were sick. Perhaps the old man, known for his foul temper and miserly ways, had simply decided to spite God that day. Monday came. The postman returned. The letter he had left on Saturday was exactly where he had placed it, untouched, unmoved. It was then that a seed of genuine dread began to take root in the minds of those who passed by. A farm is a living organism. It requires constant motion. Cows must be milked. Wood must be chopped. Snow must be cleared. To see a farm frozen in time is to see a dying thing. And yet there was the smoke. Throughout that weekend, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, neighbours passing by on the road to town looked across the fields and saw it, a thin, steady plume of grey smoke drifting up from the chimney of the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse. It curled lazily into the slate-grey sky, dispersing in the wind. This was the detail that kept them from investigating. This was the detail that paralyzed them. If there was smoke, there was fire. If there was fire, there was someone tending it. Someone was inside that kitchen, feeding logs into the stove, warming the room, cooking meals. The smoke was the alibi for the silence. It reassured the neighbors that, despite the missed church service and the unclaimed mail, life at Hinterkaifeck was continuing as normal. But imagine, for a moment, the reality of that smoke. We now know that by Saturday morning, every member of the Gruber family was already dead. They were lying cold and broken in the hay of the barn. The master of the house, the mistress, their widowed daughter, the young granddaughter, the new maid, and the innocent infant, all of them were gone. So who was feeding the fire? Who was standing in that kitchen, perhaps eating the bread that had been baked by the women who now lay murdered a few yards away? Who was sleeping in their beds? Who was moving through the rooms, listening to the wind, comfortable enough to keep the house warm? The killer did not flee in a panic. He did not run into the woods, fueled by adrenaline and terror at what he had done. He stayed. He claimed the house. For days, while the neighbors watched that comforting plume of smoke, a monster was living among them, hidden in plain sight by the very walls the victims had built too, to protect themselves. There is a particular horror in the mundane nature of this. On Tuesday, April 4th, a mechanic named Albert Hoffner arrived at the farm. He had been hired by Andreas Gruber weeks prior to repair the engine of a food chopper. Hoffner was a man of business. He arrived early in the morning, ready to work. He found the house locked. He knocked. He shouted. He banged on the windows. Nothing. Frustrated but determined to get paid, Hoffner decided to wait. He walked around the property. He heard the dog barking inside the barn, a sharp, frantic bark. He noted that the cows were bellowing, their udders swollen and painful from days of not being milked. This, finally, was a sign of neglect that could not be ignored. A farmer might skip church, he might ignore the mail, but he would never, ever let his livestock suffer. Hoffner, still unaware of the tragedy, simply decided to do the job he came for. He bypassed the house and went to the machine room. He spent 4 hours there. 4 hours. He dismantled the engine, cleaned the parts, reassembled it and tested it. He whistled while he worked. He took breaks to smoke a pipe. He later reported that he felt like he was being watched, but he saw no one. While he worked, he was only a few feet away from the barn. A thin wooden wall separated him from the bodies of the entire family. He was fixing a machine for a man who was already decomposing in the straw next door. After he finished, around the early afternoon, Hoffner grew angry. He wanted his money. He went to the house again. He even opened the stable door to feed the frantic dog, and he noted something strange. The cattle had been fed. Someone had thrown fresh fodder into the mangers. The animals were thirsty, but they were not starving. Who feeds the cattle on a farm of ghosts? Hoffner left, bewildered. On his way back to town, he met the neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He stopped him on the road. "The Grubers are gone," Hoffner told him. "The house is locked, the dog is crazy, but the engine is fixed." Lorenz Schlittenbauer listened. He was a man with a complicated history with the Grubers. He had been a suitor to the daughter, Victoria. He had claims to the paternity of the infant child. He knew the darkness of that house better than anyone. And when he heard that the cows were crying and the mail was piling up, the excuse of the smoke was no longer enough. The facade broke. Schlittenbauer gathered 2 other men from the village, Jakob Siegel and Micho Pohl. It was late afternoon now. The sun was beginning to dip towards the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the snow. The air was crisp and cold. The 3 men walked the kilometre from the village to the farm. They didn't speak much. There is a primal instinct that kicks in when you approach a place where death has taken hold. The birds seem quieter. The wind seems sharper. As they reached the courtyard of Hinterkaifeck, the silence hit them like a physical blow. The smoke from the chimney had stopped. The house stood grey and dead. The only sound was the muffled crying of the dog from inside the stable. Schlittenbauer led the way. He knew the layout of the farm. He went to the machine room, the same room the mechanic had left hours earlier. The door was broken. He pushed through into the dim interior of the fodder passage that connected the house to the barn. The air inside was thick. It smelled of old hay, unwashed animals, and something else. Something metallic and sweet that prickled the hairs on the back of their necks. They moved slowly. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the cracks in the barn wood. Schlittenbauer reached the door to the stable. He pushed it open. The scene that awaited them in the gloom of that barn would haunt Bavaria for a century. It was not just a crime scene. It was a tableau of absolute despair. But before the lantern light revealed the faces of the dead, before the screams of the men shattered the silence of the afternoon, there was that final, lingering question that hung in the cold air. If the family had been dead since Friday night, who had been keeping the house warm? We are about to step into the timeline of a massacre, but to understand how a family can be erased from the earth while their neighbors watch the smoke rise, we have to go back. We have to understand the rot that was festering in the foundation of Hinterkaifeck long before the killer arrived. We have to look at the man who built this fortress and the sins that may have invited the devil to his door, because Hinterkaifeck was not a happy home that was suddenly destroyed. It was a tragedy that had been writing itself, day by day, year by year, until the final chapter was written in blood. Chapter 2. The Sins of the Father. The snow that buried Hinterkaifeck in the spring of 1922 did not just hide the bodies. It hid a history that was already rotting from the inside out. To look at the farm from the road, it was an image of Bavarian prosperity. The buildings were sturdy, the barn was well stocked, and the fields were fertile. In a Germany that was starving, broken by the Great War, and crushed by hyperinflation, Hinterkaifeck was a fortress of stability. But wealth in this part of the world was not measured merely in marks or livestock. It was measured in reputation. And by that metric, the Gruber family was destitute long before the killer arrived. The tragedy of Hinterkaifeck did not begin with a pickaxe. It began with the patriarch, Andreas Gruber. Andreas was a man carved from the same hard earth he tilled. 63 years old at the time of his death, he was a figure who commanded fear rather than respect. In the local taverns of Grubern and Weidhofen, when his name was spoken, it was in hushed tones, usually accompanied by a shaking head or a spit on the floor. He was known as a tyrant, not just a strict father or a demanding husband, but a man who ruled his small domain with a cruelty that bordered on the sadistic. He was a man of silence, of brooding rages, and of a possessiveness that would eventually suffocate everything he touched. He had built Hinterkaifeck into a profitable enterprise, but he had done so by isolating it. He didn't trust the banks, he didn't trust the government, and he certainly didn't trust his neighbors. The farm was rumored to be filled with hidden wealth, gold coins, paper marks, and jewelry tucked away in mattress linings and floorboards. This hoarding mentality turned the farmhouse into a vault, and like any dragon guarding its gold, Andreas viewed the outside world not as a community, but as a siege. But the darkness of Andreas Gruber wasn't just about greed. It was about what happened behind closed doors. His wife, Cecilia, a woman of 72, was a shadow in her own home. The villagers whispered that she had endured decades of abuse at his hands, beaten into a quiet submission that rendered her almost invisible in the family dynamic. She was the silent witness, the enabler of his tyranny, bound to him by the strict religious and social codes of the time. However, the true rot at the heart of the family, the sin that would brand them as pariahs, concerned his daughter, Victoria Gabriel. Victoria was 35 years old. She was a woman who, by all accounts, had a strength that matched her father's, perhaps the only person on the farm who could stand toe-to-toe with him. She possessed a beautiful singing voice, leading the church choir with a clarity that seemed at odds with the darkness of her home life. But her life was a series of tragedies and scandals that had twisted her reputation in the village. Her husband, Karl Gabriel, had been killed in the trenches of the First World War in 1914. His body was never found, lost in the mud of Arras, France. Victoria was left a widow, raising her young daughter, little Cecilia, alone on her father's farm. A young widow in a rural village is often a subject of pity, but Victoria was a subject of scorn. The reason for this scorn was open knowledge. It was a matter of public record, stamped in the court documents of the district. Years prior, in 1915, the darkest rumour about Hinterkaifeck was proven true in a court of law. Andreas Gruber and his daughter Victoria were arrested and charged with incest. It is difficult for us, a century later, to understand the magnitude of this scandal in a devout Catholic farming community in the 1920s. It was a social death sentence. The court found them guilty. Andreas was sentenced to a year in prison. Victoria received a month. They served their time, but when they returned to the farm, the invisible walls around Hinterkaifeck grew 10 feet higher. They were now the other. They were the family that lived in sin. The villagers crossed the street to avoid them. The children whispered rhymes about them. The isolation that Andreas craved was no longer a choice. It was a mandate enforced by the community's disgust. This incestuous shadow hung over everything. It poisoned the air. It meant that no decent man in the village would court Victoria. It meant that Andreas Gruber was viewed not just as a harsh neighbour, but as a monster. And yet, life went on. They worked the fields. They went to church. They sat in the front pew, back stiff, ignoring the stairs burning into them from behind. They hardened themselves against the world. Then, in 1919, the situation became even more complicated. Victoria gave birth to a baby boy, Joseph. Joseph was 2 years old when he died. He was an innocent, a toddler who knew nothing of the whispers or the history of his family, but his very existence was a source of constant vicious speculation. Who was the father? Victoria was a widow. Her husband had been dead for years. The official story, the one Victoria told the court to secure alimony, was that the father was their neighbour, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer was a local man, a widower himself, who had courted Victoria for a time. He initially acknowledged the child, perhaps hoping to marry into the wealthy Gruber estate, merging their lands. But the marriage never happened. Andreas Gruber forbade it. The tyrant would not let his daughter or his property go. He chased Schlittenbauer off the land, reportedly threatening him with violence. Schlittenbauer later retracted his acknowledgement of paternity. He claimed he had been tricked. He claimed that the child wasn't his. In the taverns, late at night, the darker rumour resurfaced. The villagers looked at the baby's face. They looked at Andreas Gruber, and they did the math. Many believed that Joseph was not the son of the neighbour, but the son of the grandfather. They believed the cycle of abuse had continued, producing a child born of the very sin that had sent them to prison years before. Imagine the atmosphere in that house. A father who controls everything, a mother beaten into silence, a daughter trapped in a web of dependency and abuse, raising a child whose parentage is a shameful secret, a granddaughter, 7-year-old Cecilia, growing up in a home where secrets are the currency and silence is the law. And in the middle of this psychological pressure cooker, there was the money, the gold marks. Andreas Gruber was obsessed with his wealth. As the German currency began to collapse, losing its value by the hour, he put his faith in tangible assets. He bought gold. He kept large sums of cash. But he was paranoid. He told people he had guns. He told people he was watching. He would pace the perimeter of his farm at night, a lantern in one hand, a weapon in the other, staring out into the darkness of the witch's wood. He felt beset by enemies. He believed everyone wanted what he had. In a tragic irony, he was right, but he was looking in the wrong direction. He was watching the road, watching the neighbours, watching the thieves he imagined were coming, for his gold. He didn't realize that the isolation he had cultivated was the very thing that would doom him, because when you push the world away, when you make yourself a monster in the eyes of your neighbours, you ensure that when you scream, no one comes running. The neighbours didn't like the Grubers. They feared them, they judged them, and they avoided them. So when the strange things began to happen in March of 1922, there was no one for Andreas to confide in. A normal man might have told a friend over a pint about the footprints in the snow. A normal man might have asked a neighbor to help him search the attic. But Andreas Gruber had no friends. He had only his secrets. This was the state of Hinterkaifeck in the weeks leading up to the murders. It was a house holding its breath. It was a place where love had been warped into control, and where family bonds were forged in shame. The tension in the house was palpable, a physical weight pressing down on the roof. Maids didn't last long there. They couldn't stand the atmosphere. They spoke of a heavy feeling, a sense of being watched, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter draft. The previous maid, Crescens Rieger, had left 6 months prior because she couldn't take it anymore. She told anyone who would listen that the house was haunted. She said the attic came alive at night. She said she felt eyes on her when she was alone in her room. She packed her bags and fled, leaving the family alone with their ghosts. For 6 months, they managed without help, just the 4 of them, Andreas, his wife, his daughter, and the granddaughter, locked in their cycle of dysfunction. But the farm work was too heavy. They needed hands. So, in late March, they hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, a 44-year-old woman, kind, hard-working, looking for a steady place to rest her head. She was due to start on Friday, March the 31st. She had no idea she was walking into a tomb. She knew nothing of the incest trial, the rumors of the baby, the hidden gold, or the paranoia of the old man. She just saw a job. She packed her small trunk. She said goodbye to her sister, who escorted her to the farm. She walked through the snow, up the path to the front door, and stepped inside. She arrived in the afternoon. She would be dead before midnight. But before Maria arrived, before the final blow was struck, the farm began to receive visitors that were not of flesh and blood. The haunting that the previous maid had whispered about returned. But this time it wasn't ghosts. It was something far more tangible and far more terrifying. Andreas Gruber, the man who feared nothing but the loss of his control, began to realize that his fortress had been breached. He began to see signs that he was not alone on his land. The snowy canvas of the fields, usually pristine and white, began to bear the marks of an intruder. The silence of the attic was broken by the rhythm of footsteps. The keys to the house, always kept in a specific bowl, vanished into thin air. The tragedy of Andreas Gruber is that he was a man prepared for a fight. He was strong, he was armed, and he was vigilant, but he was prepared for a confrontation, not an infestation. He was ready for a thief who would kick down the door. He was not ready for a shadow that would slip through the cracks and live alongside him, watching, waiting, and eating his bread. The sins of the father had built the walls of Hinterkaifeck high and thick to keep the judgment of the village out, but in doing so, he had trapped his family inside with something that had been waiting in the cold. The isolation was complete, the stage was set, and as the snow began to fall again in late March, covering the tracks and muffling the sounds of the world, the trap snapped shut. Chapter 3. The Maid's Warning. There is an old saying in the Bavarian countryside. A house remembers. Wood expands and contracts with the seasons. Stone settles into the earth, and floorboards groan under the weight of passing years. Every old farmhouse has a voice. It speaks in the language of draughts and creaks, the settling of beams in the dead of night. For those who live their lives between the stable and the hearth, these sounds are just the background static of existence. You learn to ignore the wind rattling the tiles. You learn to sleep through the scratching of mice in the walls. But there is a difference between the natural settling of an old building and the sound of a house that is being invaded. 6 months before the snow turned red, in the autumn of 1921, the first crack in the fortress of Hinterkaifeck appeared. It didn't come from the outside. It came from the frantic, terrified testimony of the only person in that house who was not bound to it by blood. Crescens Rieger was the maid. In the hierarchy of a 1920s farm, she was at the bottom. She was a pair of hands, there to scrub the floors, milk the cows, and cook the meals. She was an observer, living on the periphery of the Gruber family's dark, tangled dynamic. She saw the bruising silences between Andreas and his wife. She felt the heavy, suffocating tension that hung over Victoria. but she stayed because work was scarce and she needed the bed, until she couldn't stay another night. One morning in late 1921, Creations did something that servants rarely dared to do. She stood before the tyrant, Andreas Gruber, and she quit. She didn't just give notice, she was frantic. She had her bags packed before she even spoke the words. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and rimmed with the exhaustion of sleepless nights. When asked why she would leave a warm house and a steady wage as winter approached, she didn't complain about the workload. She didn't complain about the food or the master's temper. She pointed to the ceiling. "It's not right up there," she told them. "This house is not right." Creations told the family that Hinterkaifeck was haunted. For weeks, she claimed she had been hearing things that could not be explained. It started as a feeling, the prickling sensation on the back of the neck that tells you, unequivocally, that you are being watched. She would be scrubbing the kitchen floor, the house silent around her, and she would feel eyes boring into her. She would turn, expecting to see Andreas or Victoria standing in the doorway, but the room would be empty, just the dust motes dancing in the light. Then the sounds began. At night, when the heavy silence of the countryside descended, burying the farm in a blanket of quiet so deep it rang in the ears, Creations lay in her small chamber next to the kitchen, and she heard walking. It wasn't the scuttling of rats. Rats run, they scratch and gnaw. This was different. This was the heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps. Pace, pace, pace. Someone walking back and forth directly above her head. Above the living quarters of Hinterkaifeck was the attic. It was a massive, sprawling space that ran the length of the house. It was used for storage, dried grain, old furniture, discarded tools, mounds of hay. It was a dark, cavernous lung of the house, accessible only by a trapdoor in the ceiling or a staircase from the barn. Creations knew that everyone in the family was asleep. She knew Andreas was in his room. She knew the women were in theirs. Yet the footsteps continued, heavy, deliberate, a pacing that suggested a man waiting, or thinking, or simply existing in the dark. She told the Grubers. She pleaded with them to listen. "There is someone in the attic," she said, "or something." Andreas Gruber's reaction was exactly what you would expect from a man who feared losing his gold, but had no patience for fairy tales. He scoffed. He called her hysterical. He told her it was the wind, or the settling of the beams, or her own foolish imagination running wild. He was a man of the earth, grounded in the brutal reality of farm life. Ghosts didn't plough fields. Ghosts didn't steal money. Therefore, ghosts didn't exist. But Creations was adamant. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the feeling of malevolence. She told them she felt a presence that was angry, something that was festering in the dark corners of the eaves. She was terrified to go into the barn alone. She refused to go up to the attic to fetch supplies. The fear had hollowed her out. So she left. She took her trunk and walked out of the gate, likely looking back over her shoulder at the looming grey structure of the farmhouse, breathing a prayer of thanks that she was escaping. She had no idea that her superstition was actually a survival instinct. Creations Rieger was the only one who listened to the house, and because of that, she is the only one who survived it. Her departure left the family alone. For 6 months, from the autumn of 1921 until the spring of 1922, the 4 Grubers lived in that house by themselves. No maid, no outside eyes, just the tyrant, the wife, the daughter, and the grandchild, locked in with their secrets. We have to wonder, during those 6 long months of winter, did the noises stop? Or did the family just learn to live with them? Perhaps the ghost went dormant. Perhaps the intruder, if he was already there, retreated into the woods to survive the harsh winter, leaving the attic empty for a time. Or perhaps Andreas heard the footsteps too, but his pride and his paranoia kept him from admitting that the maid was right. To admit she was right would be to admit a vulnerability, and Andreas Gruber did not do vulnerability. Winter in that part of Bavaria is brutal. The days are short, the nights are endless. The snow piles up against the windows, sealing the house in a cocoon of white. If you are hearing footsteps above your head in the dead of winter, you have 2 choices. You investigate or you go insane. Andreas did neither. He simply endured. Then came March. The thaw began. The days grew a little longer. The cycle of the farm started to wake up, and with the coming of spring, the ghost returned. But this time, the phenomena shifted. It moved from the realm of the supernatural into the realm of the undeniable. Crescens had heard noises. She had felt a presence. These are things that can be dismissed as the fancy of a tired mind. But what began to happen in March 1922 could not be dismissed. The poltergeist stopped just making noise and started interacting with the physical world. It started with the newspaper. Andreas Gruber was not a man who read the news from the city. He didn't care for politics in Munich. He cared for the price of grain and the weather. Yet, in late March, he walked out of his front door and found a newspaper lying in the snow, the Münchner Neuesten Nachrichten. He picked it up. It was crisp, clean. He looked around. The postman had not been by. No neighbor had visited. He brought it inside. He asked the family. Who bought this? No one knew. He asked the postman the next day. Did you leave this? The postman shook his head. No, Herr Gruber. No one in this entire area subscribes to that paper. Andreas kept the paper. He showed it to neighbors, grumbling about it, treating it as a strange curiosity. But think about the implication. A newspaper doesn't fall from the sky. It is a physical object. Someone bought it. Someone carried it. Someone was standing on his property close enough to drop it by the door. Then, the keys vanished. This was a critical escalation. On a farm, keys are power. They control access to the barn, the machine shed, the pantry, the house itself. A set of heavy iron keys, which hung in a specific place in the kitchen, simply disappeared. They looked everywhere, under the tables, in the pockets of coats, in the yard. Gone. For a man like Andreas, who was paranoid about thieves, this should have been the moment he grabbed his shotgun and tore the house apart. Missing keys meant someone else had access. Someone else could walk through his locked doors. Yet, strangely, he did nothing. He just complained. He changed a lock on the machine shed, but he didn't change the locks on the house. Why? Was it arrogance? Did he think he was too strong to be threatened? Or was he so accustomed to the strange atmosphere of Hinterkaifeck that he just accepted it as another burden to bear? And then came the damage. A few days before the murders, Andreas found the lock on the machine room broken, not picked, smashed. There were scratches on the wood, signs of force. And in the barn, one of the cattle was found untied, wandering loose in the stable. Someone had untied the rope. A cow cannot untie a knot. The ghost of Crescens Riga was getting bold. It was touching their property. It was reading their news. It was holding their keys. The house was no longer just whispering. It was screaming. The presence that Crescens had fled from had grown. It had occupied the space. The attic, that dark lung above the bedrooms, was no longer empty storage. It had become a living quarters. Imagine the layout. The family is downstairs, eating their soup in silence, the tension of their own personal conflicts thick in the air, and directly above them, separated only by a layer of floorboards and plaster, a stranger is lying in the hay. He is listening to their spoons scrape the bowls. He is listening to their arguments. He knows their schedule. He knows when they sleep. He holds the keys to their doors in his pocket. The maid's warning had been a prophecy. She had sensed the predation before the predator revealed himself. She had sensed the violation of the home. But because she was just a servant, just a hysterical girl in the eyes of the master, her warning dissolved into the cold air. By late March, the trap was fully laid. The family was alone. The keys were gone. The intruder was entrenched. And into this perfect storm walked Maria Baumgartner, the new maid. She was the final piece of the tragedy. She arrived on Friday, March 31st, to fill the vacancy left by Crescens. If Crescens had been there, perhaps she would have grabbed Maria by the shoulders and told her to run. "Don't go in there," she might have said. "The attic is alive." But Crescens was long gone, safe in another village, leaving Maria to walk blindly into the house that was already breathing down the necks of its inhabitants. The warning had been delivered. It had been ignored. And now, The time for warnings was over. The time for the harvest had arrived. Chapter 4. The Newspaper. We often think of hauntings as abstract things. A cold spot in a hallway, a shadow moving in the corner of your eye, a sound that has no source. These are the ghosts of folklore, the spectral residues that cannot touch us. We fear them because they are unknown, but we also dismiss them because they are not physical. You cannot hold a ghost. You cannot weigh a shadow. But the haunting of Hinterkaifeck was different. It did not just manifest in sounds and feelings. It manifested in matter. It left physical evidence in the snow, like a glitch in the reality of the farm. And the most chilling piece of this evidence was not a weapon, or a bloodstain, or a threatening note. It was a newspaper. In the timeline of the Hinterkaifeck murders, the discovery of the newspaper marks a critical turning point. It is the moment the ghost became a man. It is the moment the threat stepped out of the darkness of the attic and dropped a piece of the outside world, right onto Andreas Gruber's doorstep. It happened in mid-March 1922. The exact date is lost to the fog of history, but it was just days before the end. The farm was waking up from the long hibernation of winter. The snow was still heavy on the ground, a thick white blanket that smoothed out the contours of the land, hiding the mud and the rot beneath. In a landscape like that, anything that isn't white, grey, or brown stands out like a beacon. Andreas Gruber was a creature of habit. He walked his land with the possessive stride of a king patrolling his borders. He knew every fence post, he knew every tree. He knew exactly what belonged on his property and what did not. So, when he stepped out of his front door that morning, blinking against the harsh glare of the sun reflecting off the snow, his eyes snapped instantly to the object lying near the entrance. It was a newspaper. Now, finding a newspaper on a porch sounds like the most mundane thing in the world. In any city, in any town, it is a daily ritual. But you must remember where we are. We are at Hinterkaifeck. We are a kilometre away from the nearest village, isolated by woods and fields. We are in a place where no one passes by casually. To get to the front door of the Gruber farmhouse, you have to intend to get there. You have to walk the path. You have to open the gate. Andreas walked over to it. He picked it up. The paper was crisp. It wasn't a soggy, disintegrated mess that had been blown across the fields for miles by the winter wind. It was fresh. The ink was dark. The pages rustled in the cold air. He looked at the masthead. Münchner Neueste Nachrichten, the Munich latest news. This was the first anomaly. Andreas Gruber was a miser. He spent money only on what was necessary for the farm or for his own hoarding. He did not subscribe to a newspaper. He certainly didn't subscribe to a paper from Munich, a city that, to a rural Bavarian farmer in 1922, might as well have been on another planet. Munich was the seat of political chaos, of inflation, of the modern world that Andreas despised. He had no interest in it. He stood there in the cold, holding this alien object. He looked around. The fields were empty. The road was silent. There were no tracks leading away, or perhaps the wind had already covered them. His first thought, naturally, was the postman. Josef Mayer walked this route every day. Perhaps he had made a mistake. Perhaps he had dropped it by accident. Andreas took the paper inside. He asked the family, "Did you order this?" Victoria shook her head. Cecilia, his wife, stared blankly. No one had ordered a paper. Why would they? They barely spoke to the outside world, let alone paid for news from it. The next day, Andreas waited for the postman. When Josef Meyer arrived, trudging through the snow with his satchel, Andreas confronted him. He held up the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten. "Did you leave this?" Andreas asked. It wasn't a casual question. It was an accusation. Josef Meyer looked at the paper. He shook his head. "No, Herr Gruber, I didn't leave that." "Maybe you dropped it," Andreas pressed. "Maybe it fell out of your bag." "I don't carry that paper," Meyer replied. "No one on this entire route subscribes to the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten. Not the neighbors, not the village. No one gets this paper." Let that sink in. The postman, the one man who knew the flow of information in the entire district, confirmed that this object had no business being there. It had not come through the mail. It had not been dropped by a neighbor. So, how did it get there? This is where the psychological horror of Hinterkaifeck truly begins to twist the knife. A newspaper implies a reader. If a newspaper is found on the ground, pristine and fresh, it means someone was standing there holding it. Someone had brought it with them. Someone had been reading it, and because it was a Munich paper, it told a story about the intruder. It suggested that the man haunting the farm wasn't just a local drifter or a vagrant from the woods. He was connected to the city. He had been in Munich recently enough to buy a fresh copy, and then he had travelled the 60 miles north to the isolation of the Hexenholz. He had carried the news of the world into the silent vacuum of the farm, and then, either through carelessness or arrogance, he had left it behind. And what did Andreas Gruber do with this terrifying evidence? He kept it. He didn't burn it. He didn't throw it away. He kept it in the kitchen. In the days leading up to the murders, he even showed it to people. He mentioned it to neighbors he happened to see. He told them about the strange paper that appeared from nowhere. "It fell from the sky," he grumbled, "or the postman is a liar." This reaction tells us everything we need to know about the tragedy. Andreas Gruber was looking at a smoking gun, and he thought it was just litter. He was so convinced of his own power, so convinced that his fortress was impenetrable, that he couldn't see the threat staring him in the face. He treated the newspaper as a curiosity, a glitch, rather than what it actually was, a calling card. Imagine the scene from the perspective of the intruder. By this point, in mid-March, the killer is likely already living in the house. He is up in the attic, or hiding in the hayloft of the barn. He has watched Andreas come out. He has watched him pick up the paper. Maybe the killer was watching from the attic vent, looking down at the top of Andreas's head as the old man turned the pages of the newspaper that the killer himself had bought. Maybe he smiled. There is a terrifying intimacy in that exchange. To read a man's newspaper is to share a mental space with him. The killer and the victim were connected by that object. The newspaper also served as a timestamp. It proves that the stalking of the Gruber family was a long, drawn-out affair. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion. The killer didn't just stumble upon the farm one night and attack. He was there days, perhaps weeks, in advance. He had time to read the news. He had time to get bored. He had time to make mistakes. And yet, despite the mistake, despite the evidence lying in the snow, the outcome didn't change. The paper didn't save them. In a modern investigation, that newspaper would be a goldmine. It would have fingerprints. It would have a date. It might even have markings from a specific vendor in Munich. It would be the key to identifying the phantom of Hinterkaifeck. But in 1922, it was just trash. It was a curiosity. It sat on the kitchen table, a silent herald of the doom that was approaching. It is haunting to think about the conversations that might have happened around that table. Did Victoria read it? Did they discuss the news from the city, oblivious to the fact that the owner of the paper was listening to them through the floorboards? Did little Cecilia draw on the margins? The newspaper represents the violation of the perimeter. Hinterkaifeck was a closed loop. The Grubers wanted nothing to do with the world, and they wanted the world to have nothing to do with them. But the world had arrived. It had crossed the threshold. The ghost was no longer just a noise in the night. It was a consumer of news. It was a man with habits. It was a man who perhaps sat on the edge of the roof in the moonlight, reading the headlines, waiting for the right moment to descend. The discovery of the newspaper was the first physical breach, but it wasn't the last, because once the intruder realized that Andreas Gruber was not going to call the police, that Andreas Gruber was too stubborn, too paranoid, and too isolated to ask for help, he grew bolder. He realized that he could leave a newspaper on the doorstep and nothing would happen. So he decided to see what else he could touch. He decided to see how close he could get. The newspaper was the passive intrusion. What happened next was the active invasion. The paper was dropped. The next items would be taken. The ghost was done reading. Now he wanted the keys. The timeline was accelerating. The snow was beginning to melt, but the grip of the stranger was tightening. The paper in the kitchen turned yellow and curled in the heat of the stove, ignored and forgotten, while the man who brought it sharpened his tools in the dark. The warning had been delivered in black and white ink, but no one at Hinterkaifeck knew how to read the signs. Chapter 5. The Footprints. There is a singular, terrifying quality to snow. It is the world's most honest witness. In the mud, tracks can wash away with the rain. On the grass, footsteps disappear as the blades spring back into place. But snow captures everything. It records every movement, every passage, every intrusion with perfect freezing clarity. It turns the landscape into a manuscript of history. If you walk across a snowy field, you are writing a story that cannot be erased until the thaw comes. In late March of 1922, a fresh blanket of snow had fallen over Hinterkaifeck. It covered the mud of the farmyard, smoothed out the ruts in the road, and turned the dark expanse of the Witch's Wood into a monochrome wall of white and black. It was a blank canvas, and it was on this canvas that Andreas Gruber found the proof that his nightmare was real. It was a morning like any other, cold and still. Andreas, ever the vigilant watchman of his property, stepped out into the yard. The sun was perhaps just beginning to crest, casting those long, pale shadows across the drifts. He looked out toward the edge of his land, where the fields met the dense, tangled tree line of the forest, and he stopped. Cutting across the pristine perfection of the snow was a trail. It was dark, ugly, and deliberate. A single line of footsteps, deep and heavy, marring the white surface. Andreas was a hunter. He knew tracks. He knew the scatter pattern of a deer, the loping gait of a wolf, the clumsy trot of a stray dog. These were none of those. These were the prints of a man wearing heavy boots, a man walking with purpose. He walked out to meet them. The air was biting, freezing the breath in his lungs, but the heat of anger was likely already rising in his chest. Trespassing was a sin at Hinterkaifeck. He followed the line. He traced it back to its origin. The tracks emerged from the deep darkness of the Hexenholz, the Witch's Wood. The forest had always been a place of superstition for the locals, a dark tangle of roots and shadows that swallowed the light. To see footprints emerging from that specific patch of trees felt like seeing something crawl out of a grave. The intruder had come from the wilderness. He had stood at the edge of the trees, perhaps watching the house for a moment, and then he had stepped out into the open. Andreas turned and followed the tracks forward, toward the farm. He walked in the footsteps of the stranger, step for step. He could feel the stride. It was a confident walk. The intruder hadn't run. He hadn't crouched or tried to hide his approach. He had walked straight toward the farmhouse as if he owned it. The trail led across the open field, over the boundary line, through the gate, and into the courtyard. Andreas followed them with his eyes, expecting to see them loop around. He expected to see where the thief had circled the barn, perhaps checked a window, and then turned back to the safety of the woods. He looked for the return trail. He looked for the set of footprints leading away from the house, back into the safety of the trees. He looked left. He looked right. He scanned the entire perimeter of the yard. There were no other tracks. The footprints led in. They stopped at the buildings, and they never left. This is the moment where the logic of the world broke down for Andreas Gruber. It is a simple physical equation. If a man walks into a room and does not walk out, he is still in the room. If a man walks onto a snow-covered farm and there are no tracks leaving, he is still on the farm. Andreas stood in his courtyard, surrounded by the silence of the morning, and realized that the equation had only one solution. The man from the woods was somewhere within the walls of Hinterkaifeck. He followed the tracks to their final destination. They didn't go to the front door. They didn't go to the kitchen window. They led directly to the machine room. The machine room was a critical part of the farm's anatomy. It was attached to the barn, housing the heavy engine used to power the chaff cutter and the saw. It was a loud, oily, industrial space. It had a heavy door, secured with a strong iron lock. Andreas approached the door. The footprints ended here. The snow around the threshold was trampled, as if the stranger had stood there for some time, working. Andreas reached for the lock. It was broken. It hadn't been picked with a wire. It hadn't been shimmied open. It had been smashed. There were deep scratches on the wood, gouges in the metal. Violence had been applied here. The intruder had forced his way in, breaking the iron seal of the farm. Andreas pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges. The machine room was dark, smelling of grease and cold metal. He stepped inside. He looked around. The engine sat silent. The tools hung on the walls. It appeared empty, but the broken lock and the one-way footprints screamed otherwise. This was the escalation. The newspaper had been a passive message. I am watching. The broken lock was an active aggression. I am entering. The perimeter had been breached. The outer wall had fallen. Now, any rational man, standing in a broken doorway, with undeniable proof that an intruder was hiding on his property, would have done one thing. He would have run. He would have gone to the neighbors. He would have gone to the police in Schrobenhausen. He would have gathered a posse of men with rifles and dogs to sweep the barn. But Andreas Gruber was not a rational man. He was a creature of pride. He did not go to the police. He did not ask for help. Instead, he went into the house. He told the family what he had found. Tracks, he lightly grumbled, leading from the woods. Someone broke the lock. Imagine the terror this must have instilled in the women. Cecilia, the beaten wife. Victoria, the isolated daughter. They were already living in a house of whispers and missing keys. Now, the patriarch tells them that a man walked out of the forest and broke into the barn, and he hasn't left. Andreas decided to handle it himself. He searched the barn. He climbed into the hayloft. He poked a pitchfork into the straw. He walked the length of the stables. But a barn is a massive place. It is a labyrinth of shadows, stacked hay bales, hidden corners, and high rafters. A man who wants to hide in a barn can remain invisible for days if he stays still. The intruder could have been buried deep in the hay, breathing quietly while Andreas walked right past him. He could have been watching Andreas through the cracks in the floorboards of the loft. Andreas found no one, so in a display of breathtaking arrogance, he simply tried to reset the security. He didn't evacuate the family. He didn't call the authorities. He simply fixed the lock. He found a new padlock, or perhaps repaired the hasp, and he locked the machine room door again. Think about the futility of that action. The tracks led inside. By locking the door from the outside, Andreas wasn't keeping the danger out. He was locking the danger in. He was sealing the intruder inside the structure of the house. That night the sun went down over the snow. The temperature dropped. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves of the house. Inside, the family ate their dinner. They sat by the stove. They went to their beds. But the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Before, the haunting was a suspicion. It was a noise in the attic. Now, it was a certainty. There was a man on the farm. Did Andreas sleep that night, or did he lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening? Did he hear the soft thud of boots on the attic floorboards and realize, with a sinking dread, that the tracks outside were connected to the sounds inside? Did he realize that the man who walked out of the witch's wood had simply moved upstairs? The footprints in the snow remained there for days. They froze into ice. They became a monument to the invasion. Every time anyone walked out the back door, they saw them, the two dark lines of holes punching through the white crust, a constant silent reminder. He came from the woods. He came to the door. He is still here. The neighbors later reported that Andreas had told them about the tracks. He spoke of them with a mix of confusion and irritation. I found tracks, he told a neighbor in the field, but I couldn't find the man. It is the tragedy of the witness who sees the train coming, but refuses to get off the tracks. Andreas stared directly at the evidence of his own impending death, and he blinked. He chose to believe in his own authority over the reality of the situation. He believed that a lock would stop a monster. He believed that his reputation would protect him. But the man in the attic didn't care about Andreas Gruber's reputation. He didn't care about property lines. He had walked out of the forest with a purpose. He had crossed the snow with a weapon in his mind. He had breached the sanctuary. The footprints were the final warning. The newspaper was the notice. The tracks were the arrival. The stage was now fully set. The players were all in position. The family was downstairs, trapped in their routine. The killer was upstairs, or in the barn, trapped in his waiting. The snow held the secret. It pointed a finger directly at the machine room. It shouted the truth to anyone who would look. The call was coming from inside the house, but the snow would soon melt, and when it did, it would mix with something far darker than mud. The time for warnings was over. The time for the lock to be broken for the last time was approaching. The footsteps had stopped moving. Now they were waiting for the moment to strike. Chapter 6. The Attic. There is a specific kind of darkness that exists only in the attic of an old house. It is a darkness that smells of dry rot, ancient dust, and memories that have been packed away and forgotten. It is a space that exists between the living world below and the cold sky above. In a farmhouse like Hinterkaifeck, the attic was not designed for comfort. It was a utility space, a cavernous lung that ran the length of the building, filled with mounds of hay, discarded furniture, and the detritus of a lifetime of farming. It was a place where the shadows were permanent. And in the final days of March 1922, it was the place where the family's nightmare had taken up residence. We have spoken of the footprints leading to the house. We have spoken of the newspaper and the broken locks. But the true horror of Hinterkaifeck was not what was happening outside the walls. It was what was happening inside them. The siege had moved from the perimeter to the interior. The days leading up to March 31st were defined by a suffocating paranoia. Imagine the atmosphere at the dinner table. Andreas, the tyrant, sitting in simmering silence. Cecilia and Victoria, exchanging nervous glances. Little Cecilia, sensing the fear of the adults, likely staying quiet and small. They were all listening. They were all waiting for the sun to go down, because they knew that when the light faded, the house would wake up. It started with the keys. In any home, keys are the symbols of authority and security. They decide who comes in and who stays out. Andreas Gruber was a man who believed in locks. He had wealth to protect. But a few days before the end, the keys to the main house vanished. This was not a simple case of misplacing an object. On a farm, everything has a place. The keys hung on a hook or sat in a bowl. They were part of the ritual of the day. To lose them was inconvenient. For them to vanish into thin air was terrifying. The family tore the house apart looking for them. They checked the pockets of coats, the drawers, the space beneath the floorboards. Nothing. The keys were gone. Think about the implication of that. The killer, hiding in the shadows, had managed to get close enough to the center of the household to take the one thing that guaranteed their safety. By stealing the keys, he had stripped them of their ability to lock him out. He could now move freely. He could open the front door. He could walk into their bedrooms while they slept. He had effectively turned their home into an open cage. But even without the keys, the family could have barricaded themselves in. They could have nailed the doors shut. They didn't. Why? Because the threat was still ambiguous. It was a ghost. It was a series of odd occurrences. It hadn't yet shown its face. And then the noises began in earnest. The maid, Crescens, had warned them 6 months prior. She had fled because of the walking in the attic. Now, the walking returned. Andreas Gruber told his neighbors, likely the few he spoke to while buying supplies, that he was hearing footsteps again. But these weren't vague creaks in the night. He described hearing a person walking directly above his bedroom. Sleep is the most vulnerable state a human can be in. To sleep, you must trust your environment. You must trust that the walls will hold and the doors will lock. The Grubers went to bed every night knowing that trust had been broken. Imagine lying in the dark. The house is freezing cold, the fire in the stove having died down to embers. You are staring up at the wooden planks of the ceiling, and then you hear it. Thump, thump, thump. The slow rhythmic pace of heavy boots on wood. It is the sound of a man pacing. It is the sound of a man waiting. Andreas Gruber was not a coward. He was a man of violence. He owned a gun. He was known to patrol his land with a weapon. So why, when he heard the intruder directly above his head, did he not storm the attic? Perhaps he did. We can imagine Andreas, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other, climbing the narrow wooden stairs or pushing open the trap door that led to the darkness above. The light of the lantern would swing wildly, illuminating piles of straw and old crates, casting long, dancing shadows against the rafters. "Who is there?" he might have shouted, but the attic of Hinterkaifeck was a perfect hiding place. It was filled with hay. A man could burrow into the straw and become invisible. He could lie perfectly still, inches away from the searching light, holding his breath while Andreas stomped past. Or perhaps the intruder moved to the barn loft, slipping through the connecting passages that turned the farm into a maze. Andreas would find nothing, just the dust settling in the air, just the silence mocking him. He would go back downstairs, angry and confused. "It is nothing," he would tell the women. "Just the wind, just rats." But rats don't wear boots, and the wind doesn't steal keys. The psychological toll this must have taken on the family is unimaginable. This is the definition of gaslighting, but performed by a killer. He was dismantling their reality piece by piece. First, he touched their property, the newspaper. Then, he touched their borders, the lock. Then, he took their security, the keys. Now, he was taking their sleep. He was letting them know he was there, but he refused to show himself. He was savoring the terror. He was living with them. There is evidence that the killer made himself comfortable during this time. Later investigations found hollows in the hay where someone had been sleeping. They found roof tiles that had been shifted to create lookout points, allowing the intruder to watch the courtyard and the fields without being seen. He had turned their home into his observation post. While the Grubers worked the fields during the day, exhausted and frayed, the killer was likely sleeping in their attic, warm in the hay, resting up for the night ahead. When they came in to eat, he woke up. When they slept, he walked. This proximity is what makes Hinterkaifeck unique among true crime stories. Usually, the killer is a stranger who breaks in, commits the act, and leaves. Here, the killer was a roommate. He was a parasite attached to the host, feeding on their fear before he fed on their lives. And still, Andreas did not call the police. This is the question that has plagued historians for a century. Why did he stay? Why did he not take his family and go to the village? Why did he not summon the gendarmerie? We must look at the character of the man. Andreas Gruber was a man who had been to prison. He was a man who was hated by his community. To go to the police would be to invite the authorities back into his life, the same authorities who had branded him an incestuous criminal. He did not trust the law. He believed he was the law on his own land. Furthermore, he was stubborn. To leave the farm would be to admit defeat. It would be to leave his gold, his livestock, and his legacy unguarded. He prioritized his possessions over his safety. He believed, perhaps, that he could handle whatever this was. He thought it was a thief, a vagrant, someone he could scare off with a shotgun and a shout. He did not realize he was dealing with something far more patient and far more deadly. The isolation of the farm, which he had cultivated for years, was now his cage. The nearest neighbor was hundreds of meters away. The village was a kilometer away. A scream from the farmhouse would simply be swallowed by the snow and the trees. As March turned to April, the tension inside the house reached its breaking point. The family was living in a state of siege warfare, but the enemy was invisible. They were trapped in a loop of fear. The keys were gone. The footprints were frozen in the yard. The attic was alive with the sound of the stranger. And into this pressure cooker, on the afternoon of Friday, March the 31st, walked Maria Baumgartner. She arrived with her sister. She carried her trunk. She was looking for a fresh start. She walked through the gate, past the footprints that Andreas had not cleared away. She walked into the kitchen, where the strange newspaper sat on the table. She walked under the ceiling, where the killer lay waiting. She was the innocent variable. She had no history with the family. She had no reason to be afraid. She unpacked her things in the maid's room, the same room where Crescens had heard the voices in the walls. Maria's arrival marked the end of the waiting period. Perhaps the killer was waiting for the routine to settle. Perhaps he was waiting for the new maid to arrive, so there would be no witnesses left behind to raise the alarm if she came later. Or perhaps he was just done playing with his food. The sun began to set on that Friday evening. The work in the fields was done. The cattle needed to be tended to one last time. The house grew dark. The attic grew quiet because the walker had stopped pacing. He was no longer waiting above. He was preparing to come down. The haunting was over. The execution was about to begin. Chapter 7, March 31st. Dates are usually just markers of time. They are notations in a diary or circles on a calendar, signifying birthdays, harvests, or holidays. But sometimes, a date becomes a scar. It ceases to be a measure of time and becomes a measure of tragedy. In the history of German crime, Friday, March the 31st, 1922, is such a date. It is the day the world stopped for 6 people. It is the day the isolation of Hinterkaifeck turned from a lifestyle into a death sentence. The morning broke grey and cold. The thaw was beginning to turn the snow into a heavy wet slush, but the chill still bit through the wool of heavy coats. On the surface, the farm appeared to be functioning as it always did. Smoke rose from the chimney. The cattle moved in their stalls. Andreas Gruber, likely grumpy and silent, went about his chores. But this Friday was different because of the arrival. Around the early afternoon, 2 women walked up the path leading to the farmhouse. One was Maria Baumgartner, the new maid. The other was her sister, who had accompanied her to help carry her trunk and to see her settled in. Maria was 44 years old. She was a woman of the working class, sturdy, reliable, and looking for stability. She had no idea she was walking into a house under siege. To her, Hinterkaifeck was just a building. It was a job. She didn't know about the footprints that had frozen in the yard just days before. She didn't know about the keys that were missing from the kitchen hook. She didn't know that the man who hired her, Andreas, was sleeping with a gun because he heard footsteps above his bed. The tragedy of Maria Baumgartner is the tragedy of timing. If she had arrived a week earlier, she might have sensed the danger and fled like Kreskens did. If she had arrived a day later, she would have found a silent house and walked away alive. Instead, she arrived at the precise moment the trap was set to spring. Her sister stayed for a short while, perhaps drinking a cup of coffee in the kitchen. Imagine the scene, the family, sitting there, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria. Were they acting strange? Did they seem on edge? Or were they so practiced at hiding their dysfunction that they appeared normal to the outside world? We will never know what was said. We only know that after a short time, Maria's sister stood up to leave. She said her goodbyes. Maria likely walked her to the door, or perhaps to the gate. They hugged. The sister turned and walked away down the road, back toward the village. She was the last person on earth, outside of the killer, to see the Gruber family alive. As she walked away, Maria Baumgartner turned back to the house. She picked up her trunk and carried it into the maid's room. She began to unpack. She laid out her few possessions. She made her bed. She was preparing for a new life. She had less than 6 hours to live. As the afternoon wore on, the sun began to dip toward the horizon. In farming, this is the time of the final chores, the blue hour. The light fades, the shadows lengthen, and the world begins to shrink down to the circle of lamplight. It was in this twilight that the dynamic of the farm shifted. For days, the killer had been passive. He had been a watcher, a listener, a thief of keys and newspapers. But as the sun set on March 31st, he became active. He moved to the barn. The barn at Hinterkaifeck was a massive structure connected to the house by a covered passageway. This passage allowed the farmers to move from the kitchen to the stables without stepping out into the snow. It was a convenient piece of architecture, but on this night it was a fatal funnel. It meant that the family could be lured into the kill zone without ever sensing the danger of the outside world. The killer positioned himself in the stable. He had a weapon. It was a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a pick on one side and an adze blade on the other. It was a tool designed for breaking hard earth and chopping roots. In the hands of a strong man, it was an instrument of devastation. He waited. The brilliance of his plan, if we can call such evil brilliant, was in the separation. He knew he couldn't take them all at once. Andreas was strong. Victoria was sturdy. If he attacked the group in the kitchen, there would be screaming. There would be a fight. Someone might escape. So, He decided to dismantle the family piece by piece. He needed to get them to come to him, one by one. How did he do it? The most prevailing theory, supported by the evidence of the scene, is that he used the animals. He created a disturbance. Perhaps he untied a cow, letting it wander loose in the stable, kicking at the wood. Or perhaps he simply made a noise, a crash, a bang, something that demanded attention. Inside the warm kitchen, the family would have heard it. A restless animal, a strange sound. Go check the barn, Andreas might have said. Or perhaps Victoria, always the one to do the heavy lifting, went first. Someone stood up from the table. They opened the door to the connecting passage. They walked down the narrow, dark corridor, the smell of hay and manure getting stronger. They stepped through the door into the barn. And the darkness struck. The first victim died instantly. A single brutal blow to the head. There was no scream, no warning. The body fell into the hay. The killer didn't panic. He didn't run. He covered the body with straw, or perhaps an old door, and he reset the trap. He waited again. Back in the kitchen, the others waited. Why was it taking so long? Why hadn't Victoria returned? The soup was getting cold. The silence stretched out. Curiosity turned to annoyance, or perhaps a flicker of worry. So the next person stood up. I'll go see what she's doing. Maybe it was Cecilia, the mother. She walked the same path. She opened the same door. She stepped into the same darkness, and she met the same fate. One by one, Andreas Gruber, the tyrant who had built walls to keep the world out, walked into his own barn and was struck down by the intruder he had ignored for weeks. The man who had found the footprints and locked the door from the outside was killed by the man he had locked inside. And then, the most tragic of all, little Cecilia, 7 years old. She likely went looking for her mother or her grandfather. She walked into the barn, a small figure in a nightgown or a dress. She saw things no child should see. She was struck down next to her family. The police later found that she had survived the initial blow. She lay in the straw for hours, amidst the bodies of her parents and grandparents, tearing clumps of her own hair out in terror and pain before she finally succumbed. She was the only one who had time to realize what was happening. 4 bodies lay stacked in the barn. The silence returned, but the killer wasn't done. He knew the count. He had been watching them for days. He knew there were 2 more. He left the barn. He walked through the connecting passage, the mattock heavy in his hand, dripping. He walked into the kitchen. The room was empty now, the food perhaps still sitting on the table, the fire still burning in the stove. He moved to the maid's room. Maria Baumgartner had likely gone to bed, or was resting after her journey. She never even unpacked her trunk fully. She died in her room, killed by a stranger in a house she didn't know. Her career at Hinterkaifeck lasted less than 6 hours. And finally, the killer moved to the bedroom of Victoria Gabriel. In the crib lay Josef, 2 years old, sleeping. The killer did not spare him. With a ruthless efficiency that chills the soul, he ended the Gruber bloodline completely. The entire massacre likely took less than an hour. By the time the moon was high over the witch's wood, the house was silent. 6 people were dead, but the killer did not leave. This is the detail that separates Hinterkaifeck from almost every other crime in history. A normal murderer flees, the adrenaline fades, the horror of the act sets in, and the instinct for self-preservation takes over. They run to the woods. They wash the blood off in a creek. They put miles between themselves and the bodies. The monster of Hinterkaifeck stayed. He was exhausted, perhaps. It was hard work, so he made himself comfortable. He didn't just stay for an hour to loot the place. He stayed for the night, and the next night, and the next. Imagine the psychology of a man who can slaughter a family with a pickaxe and then walk into their kitchen and make himself a snack. He lit the fire. He cooked food. He fed the dog, which was tied up in the barn near the bodies. That night, Friday, March 31st, the farm became a tomb, but it was a tomb with a caretaker. The neighbors saw the smoke rising the next morning and thought, the Grubers are awake. They were wrong. The Grubers were gone. The thing that was awake in the farmhouse was something else entirely. As the date of March 31st came to a close, the snow began to settle again. The wind howled around the eaves, rattling the windows. Inside, the house was warm. The cattle chewed their cud. The dog slept. And in the barn, covered by hay and an old door, the victims lay in the freezing dark, waiting to be found. The transition was complete. Hinterkaifeck was no longer a home. It was a crime scene waiting for an audience. But the audience wouldn't arrive for 4 long days. For now, the house belonged to the devil in the snow. Chapter 8, The 3 Days. If you study the history of violence, you will find a pattern. The act of murder is usually an explosion. It is a moment of high entropy, a shattering of order. And once that energy is expended, the perpetrator almost always flees. They are repelled by what they have done. The sight of the body, the smell of blood, the overwhelming reality of the crime drives them away. They run to the woods, they board trains, they vanish into the anonymity of the city. To kill is to cross a line. To stay is to pretend the line never existed. But at Hinterkaifeck, the explosion was followed not by flight, but by a domestic routine. This is the chapter of the story that turns the stomach not because of the gore, but because of the audacity. We are entering the period known as the 3 days. Saturday, April the 1st. Sunday, April 2nd. Monday, April 3rd. During these 72 hours, the 6 members of the Gruber household lay dead. 5 were stacked in the barn like cordwood, covered with hay and a door. 1, the maid Maria, lay in her bed. Little Joseph lay in his crib. And yet, the house was alive. Imagine the sun rising on Saturday morning. The storm has passed. The air is crisp. In a normal world, the rooster crows, the farmer wakes, and the day begins. In the house of death, the day began, but the farmer was a ghost. The killer woke up. We do not know where he slept. Did he sleep in the attic, returning to his nest in the straw, or in a display of ultimate conquest? Did he sleep in Andreas Gruber's bed? Did he lay his head on the pillow of the man he had just slaughtered, surrounded by the personal effects of a family that no longer existed? The first task of the day was the livestock. Hinterkaifeck was a working farm. It had cows, pigs, and chickens. Animals do not understand murder. They only understand hunger. When the sun came up, the cows began to bellow. Their udders were full. They needed to be milked. They needed to be fed. A panicked killer would have let them starve. A panicked killer would have ignored the noise, terrified that it would draw attention, and run. The killer of Hinterkaifeck went to the barn. He walked past the bodies. He had to. To get to the feed, to get to the stalls, he had to walk within feet of the mound of hay, where Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the child lay. He stepped through the scene of his own atrocity. He didn't recoil. He didn't flee. He picked up a pitchfork. He threw fodder into the mangers. He tended to the beasts. This single act is the most baffling piece of the puzzle. Why? Was it a bizarre act of mercy toward the animals? Was it a practical decision to stop them from making noise that would alert the neighbors? Or was it something deeper, a twisted form of role-play? Was the killer playing house? For 3 days, was he pretending to be the master of Hinterkaifeck? He fed the cattle, but he did not milk them. When the mechanic arrived days later, he noted the cows were in pain, their udders swollen. So the killer did just enough to keep the farm quiet, but not enough to maintain it. He was maintaining the illusion of life, not life itself. Then there was the dog. The Spitz dog, the family pet, was a creature of some aggression. It was known to bark at strangers, yet the killer managed it. At some point the dog was tied up in the barn. Later it was found inside the house. The killer handled the animal. He fed it. He controlled it. The dog, which should have been the alarm system, became another roommate, and then the smoke. We return to the image that haunted the neighbors. All through Saturday and Sunday, smoke rose from the chimney. This means the killer was in the kitchen. He was stoking the stove. He was keeping the house warm. Why? It was April. It was cold, yes, but a man on the run doesn't need comfort. He needs distance. But this man wanted warmth. He sat in the kitchen. He opened the pantry. He found the bread that Victoria had baked. He found the meat Cecilia had prepared, and he ate. He sat at the table where the family had eaten their last meal. He used their knives. He drank their coffee. There is a terrifying intimacy in eating the food of your victims. It is a biological conquer. You are consuming their energy. You are sustaining your life with the provisions they gathered for their own future. What did he do during the long hours of the day? The farm is isolated. There is no radio. There is no distraction. Did he sit in the silence? Did he read the rest of the newspaper he had brought? Did he go through their drawers? We know he searched the house, but he didn't toss it. This wasn't a frenzied burglary where drawers are pulled out and dumped on the floor. It was a surgical search. He found money. He took gold coins. He took paper marks. But he left many valuables behind. He didn't take the jewelry Victoria was wearing. He didn't strip the house bare. This suggests that theft was a motive, but perhaps not the only motive. Or perhaps he just took what he could carry in his pockets, knowing he had to leave eventually. But he didn't leave on Saturday. He stayed another night. Saturday night came. The darkness returned. The house, warm and fed, settled down. The killer slept again in the tomb. Sunday morning. The church bells in Weidhofen would have been ringing across the fields. The sound would have drifted through the windows of Hinterkaifeck. This was the moment of danger. The Grubers were regulars. Their absence would be noticed. The killer must have known this. He must have stood by the window, watching the road, waiting to see if anyone would come to check. He saw the neighbors walking to mass. He saw them looking at the house. He saw them see the smoke, and he realized his disguise was working. The smoke was his alibi. The neighbors assumed the Grubers were home, perhaps sick, perhaps stubborn, but alive. The killer had successfully weaponized the family's isolation against them. He knew that no one would come knocking because no one liked the people inside. He was safe in the bubble of their bad reputation. Sunday passed. He ate again. He fed the cattle again. It is the banality of these 3 days that chills the blood. If he had spent the time painting symbols on the walls or arranging the bodies in a ritual, we could classify him as a chaotic madman. But he didn't. He spent the time doing chores and eating snacks. He acted like a farmer. He acted like he belonged there. This behavior suggests a personality that is incredibly cold, detached, and perhaps familiar with the farm. Was it someone who had worked there before? Someone who knew the routine? Someone who felt that, in some twisted way, this farm was owed to him? Or was it simply a vagrant, a man so destitute and broken by the post-war chaos that a warm house with dead bodies was preferable to the freezing woods? Was he just enjoying the luxury of a roof and a full pantry, indifferent to the corpses next door? Monday came. The third day. This was the day the postman came back, Joseph Meyer. He walked up to the window. He saw the mail from Saturday was still there. He knocked. No answer. He left. The killer was inside. He heard the knock. He held his breath. He waited for the footsteps to recede. This was the day the illusion began to crack. The coffee seller came. The neighbors began to talk. Why didn't we see them at church? Why is the dog barking like that? The killer must have sensed the shift. The grace period was ending. The smoke could only buy him so much time. The cattle were getting restless, their udders screaming in pain because he hadn't milked them, only fed them. The noise of the animals was becoming a siren. Sometime on Monday, or perhaps early Tuesday morning, he decided it was time to go. He didn't run in a panic. He packed. He took the money he had found. He took some food. He likely took the mattock, the murder weapon, and dismantled it, hiding the head in the attic floorboards, a final secret left for the police to find years later. He walked out the door. He locked it behind him. Think about that. He locked the door. He sealed the tomb. He took the keys he had stolen days before, and he walked away. He walked past the machine room where he had broken in. He walked past the footprints in the snow that marked his arrival. He walked to the edge of the property, stepped onto the road or back into the witch's wood, and he vanished. He left behind a house that was warm. He left behind cattle that were fed. He left behind a table with crumbs on it, and he left behind 6 bodies that were beginning to decompose. For 3 days, Hinterkaifeck had been the home of a monster. He had lived in the skin of the victims' lives. He had tried on their existence. And when he was done, he discarded it like a used coat. When the mechanic Albert Hofner arrived on Tuesday, the killer was gone. But the presence was still there. Hofner felt it. He whistled to keep his courage up. He felt eyes on him. He didn't know that the eyes were gone, but the malice remained. The 3 days are the black hole of the Hinterkaifeck mystery. They are the void where the answers should be. If the killer had fled immediately, we would look for a man in a panic, but we are looking for a man who can kill a child and then fry an egg. We are looking for a man who can sleep in a house of death and wake up refreshed. We are looking for a man who is not quite human. As the sun set on Monday night, the house was finally truly empty. The smoke stopped rising. The fire went out. The cold began to creep back in, reclaiming the rooms. The cattle lowed in the dark, confused and in pain. The dog whined. The caretaker had resigned. The stage was empty, and the curtain was about to rise on the discovery. Chapter 9. The Discovery. The silence of Hinterkaifeck had lasted for 4 days. It was a silence that had been artificially maintained by the killer, a deception built of smoke and closed curtains. But on Tuesday, April 4th, 1922, the deception shattered. The 3 days of the intruder's residency were over. The killer had slipped away into the night, leaving the stage empty for the final act, the discovery. It began not with a scream, but with the clanking of tools. Around 9 in the morning, a man named Albert Hofner arrived at the farm. Hofner was a mechanic from the nearby village. He was a man of metal and oil, concerned with pistons and gears, not ghosts and rumors. He had been hired by Andreas Gruber weeks prior to repair the engine of a feed chopper, a large, noisy piece of agricultural machinery housed in the machine room. Hofner walked into the yard, his tool bag heavy on his shoulder. The morning was bright, the snow melting into a slushy grey mess under the April sun. He approached the house and knocked. He expected the gruff voice of Andreas or the face of the new maid. He got nothing. He knocked again. He peered through the windows. The house was still. Hofner was annoyed. Farmers were usually up before dawn. To find a farm sleeping at 9 in the morning was laziness, and laziness annoyed him. He walked around to the back. He checked the barn doors. He called out, "Herr Gruber, I'm here for the engine." The only answer was the barking of the dog. The Spitz was inside the barn, tied up, barking with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. And underneath the barking, Hofner heard the cattle. They were restless, shifting their weight, letting out low, pained moans. Hofner stood in the yard, debating what to do. He had walked a long way. He wasn't going to turn around just because the Grubers were being rude. He decided to do the job anyway. He knew where the engine was. He didn't need Andreas to hold his hand. He walked to the machine room. The door was closed. He opened it and stepped inside. For the next 4 hours, Albert Hofner worked alone at Hinterkaifeck. This is one of the most chilling images of the entire story. Hofner dismantled the engine. He cleaned the carburetor. He greased the fittings. And as he worked, he whistled. He hummed folk songs to himself to pass the time. He smoked his pipe, the sweet smell of tobacco mixing with the smell of grease. He was completely oblivious. He was standing on the other side of a thin wooden wall from the bodies of the entire family. If he had stopped whistling, if he had pressed his ear to the wood, he might have heard the silence of the dead. But he didn't. He fixed the machine, tested it, and revved the engine. The roar of the motor tore through the quiet of the farm, a mechanical scream that signaled that life, or at least commerce, was returning to Hinterkaifeck. Around 1 p.m., Hofner finished. He wiped his hands on a rag. He was hungry, and he expected to be paid. He went back to the house. He banged on the door again. Still nothing. Now his annoyance turned to suspicion. He went to the stable window and looked in. The dog was there, throwing itself against the rope. The cows were clearly in distress. Hofner, being a practical man, opened the stable door and threw some fresh fodder into the mangers. He saw the animals rush to eat. He stepped back out into the yard. The smoke that the neighbors had seen all weekend was gone. The chimney was cold. The place felt abandoned. Hofner packed his tools and left. He walked back down the road toward the village of Groben. On his way, he spotted a group of men standing near a farmhouse. Among them was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Schlittenbauer is the dark horse of this mystery. He was the neighbor who lived closest to the Grubers. He was the man who had been rejected by Andreas. He was the man who had a complicated history with Victoria. He was the man who might have been the father of the dead child, Joseph. Hofner stopped. "I've just come from Hinterkaifeck," he told them. "I fixed the engine, but I didn't see a soul. The dog is going crazy, the cows are bellowing, and no one is home." Schlittenbauer listened. His face darkened. The neighbors had been gossiping all morning. The Grubers hadn't been at church. The mail was piling up. Now, the mechanic confirmed that the farm was essentially a ghost ship. Schlittenbauer made a decision. "We need to go up there," he said. "Something has happened." He gathered 2 other men, Jakob Siegel and Michael Pearl. It was late afternoon now, around 3:30 p.m. The sun was beginning its descent, casting those long, stretching shadows across the snow once again. The blue hour was approaching. The 3 men walked the kilometer to the farm. They didn't speak much. There is a specific kind of dread that builds when you approach a house that you know is wrong. The closer they got, the louder the silence became. When they arrived at the courtyard, it was desolate. The gate creaked in the wind. The windows of the house were dark eyes staring back at them. Schlittenbauer took the lead. He knew the layout of Hinterkaifeck better than the others. He had courted Victoria there. He had spent nights there years ago. He walked with a strange, frantic energy. They tried the front door. Locked. They peered into the kitchen window. Empty. "The barn," Schlittenbauer said. "We go through the barn." They walked around to the machine room, the door that the killer had broken and that Andreas had fixed, and that the killer had walked past, was now the point of entry for the discovery. They stepped inside. The machine room was cold. They moved into the fodder passage, the narrow corridor that connected the barn to the stable and the living quarters. It was dim in there. The air was thick with dust and the smell of animals. Schlittenbauer was ahead. Siegel and Pearl followed a few steps behind. As they moved deeper into the barn, the light began to fail. The windows were high and dusty, letting in only shafts of grey, dying light. The barn was a cavern of shadows. Piles of hay rose up like hills on either side of the walkway. Schlittenbauer stopped. To their right, near the door that led to the stable, there was a strange arrangement. A large wooden door, an old barn door that had been taken off its hinges, was lying flat on the floor. It was covered with hay. It looked like a makeshift platform, or perhaps a pile of debris that had been swept aside. But something was wrong with it. It was too orderly. It was too deliberate. Schlittenbauer walked toward it. The other men hung back, gripped by an instinctual revulsion. "There is someone here," Schlittenbauer whispered. He reached down. He grabbed the edge of the old door. With a grunt of effort, he heaved it aside. The hay shifted. The dust rose. And the truth of Hinterkaifeck was revealed. Underneath the door, buried in the straw, were the bodies. They were stacked. That is the only word for it. They were not scattered as if they had fallen in a fight. They were piled on top of one another like discarded dolls. First, there was Andreas Gruber, the patriarch. His face was caked in dried blood, his head shattered. Lying across him was his wife, Casilia. Next to them was Victoria Gabriel, her body twisted. And there, small and pale in the gloom, was little Casilia. Siegel and Pearl recoiled. They gasped, stumbling back into the shadows. The sight was incomprehensible. The violence was absolute. But Schlittenbauer did not run. This is the moment that has cast suspicion on him for 100 years. According to the testimony of the other 2 men, Lorenz Schlittenbauer did not act like a terrified neighbor. He acted like a man confirming a suspicion. He knelt down. He reached out and touched the bodies. He moved them. "My God!" Siegel shouted. "What are you doing? Leave them!" "I have to see," Schlittenbauer muttered. "I have to see if the boy is here." He was looking for Joseph. He was looking for his son. He dug through the hay. He lifted the cold, stiff limbs of the family he had once tried to join. He was frantic, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "He's not here," Schlittenbauer said. "The boy isn't here." He stood up. The other men were paralyzed with horror. They were standing in a tomb. The air smelled of metallic blood and old death. The silence was broken only by the heavy breathing of the three men and the low moans of the cattle in the next room. "The house," Schlittenbauer said. "We have to check the house." He didn't wait for them. He ran toward the connecting door that led to the kitchen. He knew the way. He navigated the dark corridor as if he lived there. Sigel and Pearl, terrified to be left alone with the pile of corpses, scrambled after him. They burst into the kitchen. It was empty. The table still held the remnants of a meal. The stove was cold. Schlittenbauer moved to the bedrooms. He went to the maid's room first. He pushed the door open. There, in her bed, lay Maria Baumgartner. She was on her side, covers pulled up, looking for all the world like she was sleeping, but the back of her head was a ruin. She had been struck while she lay resting. She had never even made it to her first morning of work. "She is dead too," Schlittenbauer announced. He turned and went to Victoria's bedroom. This was the room where the bassinet was kept. This was the room where the final victim lay. Schlittenbauer walked to the crib. He looked inside. The scream that must have built in his throat never came. He just stared. Little Joseph, 2 years old, lay in his carriage. He had been struck with the same heavy force. The bloodline was extinguished. Schlittenbauer turned to the other men. His face was pale, his eyes wide and wild in the gloom of the bedroom. "They are all dead," he said. "Everyone." The three men stood in the house of death. The reality of it crashed down on them. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fire. This was an extermination. And then the panic set in. The sun was down. The house was getting dark. They were standing in a crime scene that was days old, but felt terrifyingly fresh. They realized that the killer could be anywhere. He could be in the attic. He could be watching them from the woods. "We have to go," Pearl said. "We have to get the police." They rushed out of the house. They didn't lock the door. What was the point? They ran back through the courtyard, past the machine room, past the barn where the 4 bodies lay under the hay. They ran out of the gate and onto the road to Weidhofen. They ran to get the authorities. But as they ran, the image of what they had seen burned into their minds. The stack of bodies. The door used to hide them. The methodical nature of it. And for Sigel and Pearl, another image burned just as brightly. The image of Lorenz Schlittenbauer, kneeling in the bloody straw, moving the bodies with the familiarity of a man who knew exactly where to look. The discovery was made. The secret of Hinterkaifeck was out. The silence had been broken by the mechanic's engine and the neighbor's cry. Now the law would come. The inspectors from Munich would come. The psychics would come, but they would all be too late. The snow was melting, the tracks were fading, and the man who had lived in the walls, who had eaten their bread and slept in their hay, was long gone. He had vanished into the chaos of 1922 Germany, leaving behind a puzzle that would never be solved. The nightmare of the Grubers was over. The nightmare of the investigation was about to begin. Chapter 10. The Scene. When the law finally arrived at Hinterkaifeck, it did not arrive with the precision of modern forensics. There was no yellow tape. There were no white suits. There was no cordon of silence to protect the evidence. Instead, the investigation into the most brutal crime in Bavarian history began with a chaotic, muddy stampede. The news of the discovery had spread through the villages of Gröbern and Weidhofen like wildfire. By the time the gendarmerie from Schrobenhausen arrived late on Tuesday evening, the farm was already a spectacle. Locals, driven by morbid curiosity, had gathered at the gates. They peered over fences. They whispered in the dark. The police were overwhelmed. They were rural officers, accustomed to dealing with theft, poaching, or the occasional drunken brawl. They were not equipped to handle a mass extermination, and because of this, the crime scene at Hinterkaifeck was compromised almost the moment it was discovered. The first officers to enter the barn stepped into a nightmare that defied their understanding. We must visualize what they saw, not to revel in the gore, but to understand the absolute strangeness of the killer's mind. The 4 bodies in the barn, Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and the child, were not just killed, they were arranged. They lay in the fodder passage, a narrow corridor of beaten earth and straw. The killer had stacked them. He had placed the bodies on top of one another, limb over limb, creating a macabre pile of humanity. And then he had covered them. He had taken an old, heavy door off its hinges and laid it over the corpses. He had piled hay on top of the door. Why? This is the first question the investigators had to grapple with. Why hide the bodies if you're going to leave them in the barn? Why cover them with a door? Criminal psychology suggests that hiding a face, or a body, is an act of remorse, or at least an act of shame. It suggests that the killer could not bear to look at what he had done. He had to erase the humanity of his victims to continue living in the house for the next 3 days. He couldn't walk past their staring eyes to get to the cowshed, so he buried them. But the covering was imperfect. When the police lifted the door, the brutality of the attack was laid bare. The weapon was not immediately found, but its signature was written on the victims. The skulls of the Gruber family had been shattered. The wounds were distinctive. There were circular punching wounds, and there were long slashing wounds. The police doctor, Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller, arrived the next day from Schrobenhausen to perform the autopsies. Because the house was dark and the atmosphere inside was oppressive, and perhaps because the smell of death was already permeating the walls, he decided to perform the examinations right there on the farm. They set up a makeshift operating table in the courtyard. They took a door, perhaps the very door used to hide the bodies, and placed it on 2 barrels. And there, under the open sky of the Bavarian spring, with the chickens pecking at the ground and the neighbors watching from the perimeter, the doctor began his grim work. The findings were horrific. Andreas Gruber, the strong, tyrannical father, had been struck down with immense force. His face was destroyed. He had been taken by surprise, likely killed instantly. Cecilia, his wife, had similar wounds. She too had been struck down without a struggle. Victoria Gabriel, the daughter, showed signs of the same blunt force trauma, but it was the details of the other victims that broke the composure of the hardened police officers. Maria Baumgartner, the maid. She was found in her bed. The killer had walked into her room and struck her while she lay on her side. The sheets were soaked in blood, but she had not moved. She had died in her sleep, or in the moments of waking, never knowing that her new home was a slaughterhouse. Little Joseph, the toddler. He was found in his bassinet in his mother's room. The killer had smashed the canopy of the carriage to get to him. The violence required to kill a 2-year-old with a farming tool is a level of evil that stops the breath. It speaks of a total annihilation. The killer didn't just want them dead, he wanted them erased. But the most haunting discovery, the detail that keeps investigators awake at night a century later, concerned the 7-year-old girl, Cecilia. When Dr. Aumüller examined her body on that makeshift table in the yard, he found something that changed the narrative of the crime. The other victims had died quickly. Their skulls were crushed instantly by the massive weight of the weapon. But young Cecilia had survived the initial blow. The autopsy revealed that she had lain in the straw, alive, for several hours after the attack. She was lying next to the bodies of her mother and grandparents. In the darkness of the barn, bleeding and terrified, she had regained consciousness. The doctor found tufts of her own hair in her hands. In her agony and terror, the child had torn her own hair out by the roots. We can only imagine what she saw or heard in those final hours. Did she hear the killer walking nearby? Did she hear him humming as he fed the cattle? Did she try to scream, or was she too weak? She died alone in the dark, surrounded by her dead family, while the man who killed them made himself a sandwich in the kitchen just a few yards away. This single fact transforms Hinterkaifeck from a murder mystery into a tragedy of operatic proportions. It adds a layer of suffering that is almost unbearable to contemplate. While the doctor worked in the yard, the detectives from the Munich police headquarters arrived. Inspector Georg Reingruber took charge. He was a serious man, a professional, but he was stepping into a scene that had already been trampled by half the village. He moved into the house. If the barn was the scene of the death, the house was the scene of the life that followed. The kitchen was eerie. It looked like a normal farmhouse kitchen, but the silence was heavy. There were dirty dishes on the table. There were remnants of meals that the family had not eaten. There was bread that had been cut after the time of a death. Inspector Reingruber noted the glitches in the scene, the evidence of the killer's residency. He found the bed where the killer had slept. It was unmade. It had the imprint of a body. Someone had rested there, comfortable and warm, while the corpses froze in the barn. He found the pantry. It had been raided. Meat had been taken. Bread had been eaten. The killer had a healthy appetite. He found the money. This was the most confusing piece of evidence. Andreas Gruber was known to hoard cash. He had paper marks and gold coins hidden in the house. The police found a significant amount of money in a cupboard, and more hidden in a window frame. If this was a robbery, it was a failed one. Why would a thief kill 6 people and then leave the fortune behind? He had days to search. He had all the time in the world. Yet, he left the gold. This led Reingruber to a chilling conclusion. Robbery was not the primary motive. The killer didn't come for the money. He came for the family. The money he took, likely just what was in their pockets or loose on the table, was an afterthought, walking around money for his escape. The investigation moved to the attic. The police climbed the narrow stairs. They entered the space that Crescens Riga had feared so much. They found the truth of her warnings. In the hay of the attic, they found a hollow, a nest. Someone had been sleeping there. They found 2 holes in the roof tiles, moved aside to create peepholes. One looked out over the courtyard. The other looked out over the fields toward the woods. The killer had been a sniper without a rifle. He had been a voyeur. He had lain in that straw, watching the family go about their daily lives, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment. They found rotting food in the attic, suggesting he had been there for some time. As the police pieced this together, the timeline became clear. The footprints, the newspaper, the keys, the attic noises. It was all one long, continuous predation. The family had been living with their executioner for days, perhaps weeks, but the weapon was still missing. The police searched the barn. They searched the fields. They looked for a gun, a knife, a club, but based on the wounds, they knew they were looking for a mattock, a Kreuzhacker. It is a common tool on a Bavarian farm. Every farmer has one. It has a heavy wooden handle, an iron head with a pick on one side for breaking rock, and a flat adze blade on the other for chopping roots. They didn't find it, not immediately. It was as if the earth had swallowed it. It would be found a year later, hidden in the floorboards of the attic, covered in rust and blood hair, during the demolition of the farm. The killer had cleaned it, dismantled it, and tucked it away like a souvenir. For now, the police had bodies, they had a scene, and they had 1,000 questions. They began to question the neighbors. They questioned Schlittenbauer, who had found the Yin bodies. They noted his strange behavior. They noted that he seemed to know his way around the dark barn a little too well. They noted that the dog, which barked at everyone else, did not bark at him. But they had no proof. The scene was cold. The fingerprints, if there were any, had been destroyed by the crowds or the killer's own cleaning. The autopsies concluded. The bodies were placed in coffins. But before they were buried, a final bizarre decision was made. In a move that feels medieval to us now, the court in Schrobenhausen ordered that the heads of the victims be removed. The skulls were severed from the bodies. The reason? They wanted to send them to Munich to be examined by clairvoyants, psychics. The police were so desperate, so baffled by the lack of physical leads and the sheer strangeness of the crime, that they turned to the supernatural for help. So, when Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, little Cecilia, Joseph, and Maria were buried in the churchyard in Weidhofen, they were buried headless. Their skulls were packed in a box and shipped to the city, where they would eventually be lost in the chaos of the Second World War. The scene at Hinterkaifeck was cleared. The animals were sold. The house was boarded up. but the aura of the place remained. The police left, but the mystery stayed. They had documented the blood, the hay, and the torn hair. They had proven that a monster existed. But they had no name. They had only the ghost of a man who walked out of the woods, killed an entire bloodline, ate their food, and then dissolved back into the snow. The investigation was open. The files were stamped Maud. But as the weeks turned into months, the scene of the crime began to fade, taken back by the weeds and the weather. The truth of who held the mattock was buried as deep as the headless bodies in the grave. Chapter 11. The Skulls. When the dead are laid to rest, there is usually a sense of closure. The ritual of the funeral marks the end of the physical tragedy and the beginning of memory. But in the case of Hinterkaifeck, the indignity did not end with the murder. The victims were not allowed to rest in peace. Instead, they became the subjects of one of the most bizarre and desperate legal decisions in German history. After the bodies were discovered on April 4th, the investigation began in earnest. But investigation is perhaps too strong a word for the chaos that ensued. The Munich police, led by Inspector Georg Reingruber, were operating in a world that was broken. Germany in 1922 was a place of political turmoil, poverty, and post-war confusion. Resources were scarce, science was limited, and the pressure to solve a crime of this magnitude, an entire family wiped out in a single night, was crushing. The police had failed to catch the killer during the 3 days he lived in the house. Now, they were failing to find him in the weeks that followed. They had fingerprints, but they were smudged or useless, because dozens of villagers had trampled through the barn before the area was secured. They had the timeline, but it led nowhere. They had suspects, neighbors like Lorenz Schlittenbauer, wandering craftsmen, bitter relatives, but every lead turned to ash. Schlittenbauer was interrogated relentlessly, but he had alibis, or at least not enough evidence to hold him. The police were desperate. They were staring at a cold case before the bodies were even in the ground. And in their desperation, they turned away from logic and looked toward the supernatural. It is difficult for us to understand today, but in the early 20th century, the line between forensic science and spiritualism was thinner than it is now. The trauma of the First World War had created a massive interest in the occult. People wanted to believe that the dead could speak because so many had died so young. So a suggestion was made. It came from the darker corners of the investigation team, or perhaps from the frantic public prosecutor in Schrobenhausen. If the science of the living could not solve the crime, perhaps the science of the beyond could. They needed a medium. They needed a clairvoyant. They believed that if a psychic could hold a piece of the victim, they might be able to see the face of the killer, but they couldn't bring the bodies to Munich. The roads were bad, the distance was too great, and the corpses were already in a state of advanced decomposition. So the court issued an order. It is a document that stands as a testament to the sheer hopelessness of the authorities. They ordered that the heads of the 6 victims be removed from their bodies. Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller, the court physician who had performed the initial autopsies on the makeshift table in the yard, was called back. It was a grim assignment. The family had already suffered a brutal death. Now, in the name of justice, they were to be subjected to a final violation. The procedure was carried out before the funeral. The details are clinical, but the reality is horrific. The heads of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, young Cecilia, little Josef, and the maid Maria were separated from their bodies. The skulls were cleaned, they were catalogued, they were placed in boxes or jars, preserved for the journey to the city. This meant that when the day of the funeral arrived, the coffins that were carried to the Weidhofen cemetery were light at the top. The funeral of the Gruber family was a spectacle. Thousands of people attended. They came from all the surrounding villages, drawn by the horror of the story and the morbid curiosity that tragedy always attracts. The church was overflowing. The cemetery was packed with onlookers, standing on gravestones to get a better look. Imagine the scene. The priest intoning the rites of the dead, the neighbors, some of whom were suspects, standing in the front row, heads bowed, holding their hats in their hands, the silence of the crowd, and beneath the lids of the 6 coffins, the secret lay hidden. The community was burying headless bodies. The victims were going into the consecrated ground incomplete. While the bodies were lowered into the earth, the heads were on their way to Munich. They were delivered to a group of metaphysical investigators, clairvoyants, who claimed to have the ability to solve crimes through psychometry. We can only imagine the scene in some dimly lit room in Munich. A medium, perhaps holding the skull of Andreas Gruber, trying to divine the name of the man who wielded the mattock. Did they see anything? Did they hear the screams of the barn? The record shows that they saw nothing. The séance, if it happened, produced no leads. The spirits did not speak. The clairvoyants failed, just as the police had failed. The killer remained a shadow. But now, the police had a new problem. They had the skulls of 6 murder victims in their possession, and the case was going cold. The skulls remained in Munich. They were stored in a police museum or a university collection, labeled as evidence in the Hinterkaifeck murder. They became macabre artifacts, studied by students and stared at by detectives who hoped that staring long enough would unlock the mystery. They stayed there for years, through the chaos of the 1920s, through the rise of the Third Reich in the 1930s, and then came the Second World War. Munich was a target. As the Allied bombing campaigns intensified, the city was reduced to rubble. Police stations, universities, and archives were destroyed. In the chaos of the war, the boxes containing the skulls of the Gruber family were lost. Some say they were destroyed in a firebombing raid, turned to ash, along with the records of the case. Others say they were looted or simply misplaced in the frantic evacuation of the city. Whatever the cause, they vanished. The final physical link to the victims was erased by the war. Back in Hinterkaifeck, the farm itself did not survive much longer than the victims. A year after the murders, in 1923, the decision was made to destroy the house. It stood as a dark monument in the fields, a place that locals crossed themselves to pass. No one wanted to live there. No one wanted to buy it. It was cursed ground. So a demolition team was hired, and in a final twist of irony, the demolition revealed what the police had missed. As the workers were tearing up the floorboards of the attic, the very attic where the killer had lived and watched, they found something hidden in a hollow space. It was a mattock, a Kreuzhacker. It was covered in rust, but upon closer inspection, the rust was mixed with dried blood and human hair. The killer, before he left the farm on that Monday morning, had taken the time to dismantle his weapon. He had hidden the head of the tool with the meticulous care of a man putting away his things. He hadn't thrown it in the river. He hadn't buried it in the woods. He had left it in the house like a signature. The workmen found it. They also found a penknife in the hay, likely used by the killer to cut his bread. But by then, the trail was freezing cold. The skulls were in Munich, failing to speak. The bodies were in Weidhofen, decomposing in the dark. And the farm was being leveled to the ground, the stones carted away to build other houses, the wood burned. Today, if you go to the site of Hinterkaifeck, there is nothing there. It is just a flat, open field. The witch's wood still stands in the distance, dark and tangled. There is a small shrine, a mattock, dedicated to the victims, standing near the road. But the physical reality of the horror has been wiped clean. The house is gone. The weapon is lost. The skulls are dust. The investigation into Hinterkaifeck was a catalogue of failures. The police failed to protect the scene. The neighbours failed to raise the alarm. The clairvoyants failed to see the truth. But the greatest failure was the indignity visited upon the victims. They were a family who lived in isolation, hiding their secrets from the world. In death, they were exposed, autopsied in their own yard, decapitated by court order, and buried incomplete. The severing of the skulls was the final act of violence against the Grubers. It was an act committed not by the killer, but by the society that was supposed to bring them justice. It was a symbol of how completely the system had lost its way in the face of such pure, unadulterated evil. The skulls were meant to solve the puzzle. Instead, they became part of it, lost artifacts in a story that refuses to be resolved. The killer took their lives. The state took their rest, and time took the evidence. All that remains now is the question, who was he? As we move to our final chapter, we must look at the names that have whispered through history: the neighbor, the soldier, the madman. The theories are many, but the truth is likely far simpler and far more terrifying. The man in the attic was not a ghost. He was a man with a face that perhaps, for a fleeting moment, the clairvoyants in Munich almost saw in the dark. Chapter 12. The Suspects. A century has passed since the mattock fell in the barn. The snow has melted and fallen 100 times over the fields of Bavaria. The farm of Hinterkaifeck has been erased from the map, replaced by crops that grow tall in the summer and wither in the winter, indifferent to the blood that once soaked the soil beneath them. The case file in the Munich archives is thick, dusty, and ultimately empty of a conclusion. Over 100 suspects were questioned in the years following the massacre. Drifters, soldiers, criminals, and neighbors were pulled into the interrogation rooms. But despite the efforts of the police, despite the reward money, and despite the endless speculation of the public, no one was ever charged. The killer of Hinterkaifeck walked away into the darkness of 1922 and was never seen again. But while the law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, history allows us to look at the shadows and make our own judgments. And in the gallery of suspects, there is one shadow that looms larger than all the others, one man who stood at the center of the web, connected to the victims by love, hate, and secrets. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. To this day, he remains the primary suspect in the minds of many who study the case. He was the neighbor who lived just a few hundred meters away. He was the man who led the search party. He was the man who found the bodies. The case against Schlittenbauer is circumstantial, yet compelling. It is built on a foundation of strange behavior and deep personal animosity. We know he had a relationship with Victoria Gabriel. We know he wished to marry her, and by extension, marry into the wealth of the Gruber estate. We know that Andreas Gruber, the tyrant, forbade the union and chased Schlittenbauer off the property. We also know the dark confusion surrounding the parentage of little Josef. Schlittenbauer had initially claimed the boy was his, then retracted it, claiming he had been tricked. Was the existence of the child a constant reminder of his humiliation? Or worse, did he believe the rumors that the child was the product of incest between Andreas and Victoria, a sin he felt compelled to purge? His actions on the day of the discovery are the most damning evidence against him. When he walked into the barn with Sigel and Pearl, he didn't act like a man afraid of the unknown. He acted like a man who knew exactly where to look. He went straight to the stack of bodies. He lifted the door. He moved the corpses with a shocking lack of revulsion. The witnesses said he was looking for his son, but was he looking for a survivor, or was he checking his work? Furthermore, there is the matter of the dog. The Spitz was known to be aggressive towards strangers, yet the killer managed to tie the dog up and feed it for days. When the search party arrived, the dog barked at everyone, except Schlittenbauer. And then, the keys. The keys to the house were stolen days before the murder. It implies the killer had access. Schlittenbauer, as a former suitor, knew the layout of the farm intimately. He knew the routines. However, we must be careful. Suspecting a man is not the same as convicting him. Schlittenbauer lived the rest of his life in the shadow of these accusations. He was harassed by the villagers. He was called the murderer of Hinterkaifeck to his face. He fought back. He filed slander lawsuits against those who accused him, and he won. He maintained his innocence until his death in 1941. If he was the killer, it means he possessed a psychological constitution of iron. It means he slaughtered 6 people, lived in their house for 3 days, went home to his own family, and then led the police back to the scene, acting out the role of the grieving neighbor for 20 years without ever cracking. But if not Schlittenbauer, then who? There is the theory of the soldier. Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, was reported killed in France in 1914. But his body was never repatriated. In the chaos of the Great War, men vanished and identities were lost. A A persistent rumour in the village claimed that Carl Gabriel had not died. He had survived, perhaps deserted, or perhaps returned home years later to find his wife with a child that wasn't his, a child born of incest. The theory suggests that Carl Gabriel returned to the farm, hid in the attic, watched the betrayal unfold, and then exacted a military-style revenge. This would explain the killer's ability to survive in the harsh conditions of the attic. It would explain the sniper holes in the roof tiles. It would explain why he didn't steal the money. His motive was personal, not financial. After the deed, he simply walked back into the oblivion of post-war Europe, a ghost returning to the dead. And finally, there is the theory of the wandering criminals. The 1920s in Germany were desperate times. Bands of thieves and political extremists roamed the countryside. The Gump brothers, notorious robbers in the region, were considered suspects. Perhaps they broke in, the robbery went wrong, and they killed the witnesses. But this theory fails to explain the 3 days. Robbers steal and run. They do not feed cows. They do not bake bread. They do not sleep in the beds of their victims. The intimacy of the crime suggests a connection. The killer felt comfortable at Hinterkaifeck. He felt like he was the master of the house. The truth is, we will likely never know. The mattock is gone. The skulls are lost. The witnesses are dead. In 1923, the year after the murders, the farm of Hinterkaifeck was demolished. It was torn down stone by stone. The villagers wanted to erase the stain from their landscape. They found the murder weapon hidden in the floorboards during the demolition, a final message from the killer that he had been there until the very end. A memorial shrine, a mattock, now stands near the site. It is a simple religious marker, dedicated to the 6 souls who died in the dark. People still visit it. They leave flowers. They light candles. They stand in the open field and listen to the wind, wondering if it still carries the echo of the footsteps in the attic. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck is not just a story of murder. It is a story of ultimate violation. It touches on our deepest, most primal fears. We fear the intruder. We fear the idea that our homes are not safe. We fear the notion that while we are eating dinner or sleeping in our beds, someone is watching us from the darkness above. Andreas Gruber built a fortress to keep the world out. He locked his doors. He guarded his gold. But he didn't realize that the danger wasn't coming from the outside. It was already inside. It had moved in. It was listening to him breathe. The killer of Hinterkaifeck achieved the perfect crime not because he was a genius, but because he understood the silence. He used the family's isolation as a weapon. He used their secrets as camouflage. And when he was done, he didn't just leave a crime scene. He left a void that 100 years of investigation has failed to fill. He walked out of the snow, and he walked back into it. And somewhere, perhaps in a quiet village in Bavaria, or in a bustling city, a man lived out the rest of his days with the memory of those 3 days in April locked inside his mind. He shook hands with neighbors. He raised children. He grew old, and he took the name of the monster to his grave. We live our lives surrounded by noise. We fill our homes with light and sound to keep the shadows at bay. But stories like Hinterkaifeck remind us that the silence is always waiting. They remind us that we never truly know who is watching from the edge of the woods. Thank you for joining me on this descent into the cold. It is a heavy story, and one that sits uncomfortably in the mind long after the screen goes dark. If you have made it this far, you are part of the few who are willing to stare into the abyss of history. I appreciate your time and your attention. If this investigation resonated with you, if you felt the chill of the Bavarian winter, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think walked away from the farm that morning? Was it the neighbor, the soldier, or a stranger we have never named? And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. There are many more files in the archives, many more mysteries that have been lost to the fog of time. We will find them, we will open them, and we will face them together. Until then, check your locks, watch the snow, and remember, sometimes the footsteps you hear above you are not just the wind. Take care.